Rebecca and John. John has worked in the field of social housing for over 40 years as an architect, running practice John Gilbert Associates. He has a strong interest in sustainable architecture and the long-term effects of material and design choices. He worked with myself and Howard on producing a CEDA design guide, which is called Designing and Detailing for Toxic Chemical Reduction in Buildings. In fact, he prepared the drawings and the text for material substitutes for typical construction types. His practice, John Gilbert Architects, has developed a research arm with Miro, which is called HabLab, and undertakes on-site building performance evaluation and monitoring. Which brings me straight on to Jan, with whom I'm sure he works very closely at Miro, for whom I don't have a CV, but Jan is an engineer who graduated from Edinburgh in 2003, and whose first job was to come and work with Near Research. She has then gone on to work in various building services and building research appointments until she found herself very happily, as far as I can tell, here at Miro, doing, I think, precisely what she wants to be doing right now. That brings me to Andy Woodburn, who's a development consultant providing services to housing associations. The role is that of client project manager, coordinating land, funding and consultants. He is probably very well positioned to talk about the effects of health on occupants of buildings. And on my far left is Professor Andrew Watterson, who's the Fellow of Collegium Ramazzini, fair enough, leads the Centre for Public Health and Population Health Research at Stirling University and its Occupational and Environmental Health Research Group. He has, as you can imagine, a particular interest in chemical hazards and risks linked to health impact assessments, toxicology, especially relating to carcinogens and reproductive health hazards. Straight down the line, really, isn't it? He's published extensively in journals, BMJ, Lancet, and authored books on this subject. So, I think I'm going to start by asking each of the panel if they would like to briefly comment on how they found the film. Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's often an untold story that you saw there. The emphasis in a lot of discussions about some of these health issues is, particularly when you're looking at carcinogens and also related diseases, it's all down to lifestyle. It's because you eat the wrong things, because you smoke, because you drink too much, because you don't have any exercise. And sometimes the whole environmental picture is left out. That was very unusual to see because it had turned it all round on its head. So there was a lot in there about associations of environmental exposures to diseases. And of course that's a big debate. And perhaps in the discussion we'll get on to some of the ways of addressing this, because a lot of it I think links in with the World Health Organization and others' approach about the precautionary principle, about toxic use reduction, about sunsetting hazardous chemicals and so on. So I think it gave us a lot of the potential problems and is leaving us perhaps to start to explore the solutions.
Andy,
yeah, just trying to, I found, I suppose on a kind of personal level, I suppose I found one of the things a bit distressing was that, or fortunate in a way, that probably my generation have peaked in terms of our kind of overall health from the improvements that have been made in healthcare generally for ordinary people through the last century. But you know, the concern that that's now deteriorating as we pass on to our children, and perhaps more significantly onto our grandchildren. And I think the other one that I found kind of distressing was the notion of the mother passing on chemicals of which she's not aware, and that not just proportionally, but disproportionately passing on levels of goodness that would normally sustain her in disproportionate amounts to our child. I think I'll leave it at that. If there's issues that would come up about my role as Commissioner of Buildings, we'll maybe look at that separately.
Jan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I don't know if this is on. Is this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I found the film quite distressing as well, and yeah, it touched on building materials, but I don't think before I joined Mira, I was a natural soap maker as well, and made natural soaps and creams, and I don't feel that it's kind of gone enough, and it's not discussing enough about the cosmetics and things that we use in the house every day, things that we use like candles and washing up liquids and things like that. So it would be quite good if we could extend the discussion to that as well as the building materials.
Yeah, I mean, it was reinforcing what we sort of always think that chemicals do. And in writing the report with Hard, and Hard was absolutely dedicated to looking at the chemicals and the effect it had. And I would say I was nearly sceptical until I was drawn into it, really through Hard's encouragement and the drawing of alternative details that you could produce. And when we produced the report at the end, you know, because I looked at air quality a lot more and the effect of plasticizers and phthalates and everything else. And when we wrote what we wrote, the British Plastics Foundation came and started saying, we're going to sue us, basically. And you'll see if you download the CEDA report on that, big black spots where things had to be cut out, simply because we didn't have any funds. Not really because, you know, we were still going in the right direction. Unfortunately, there's a very strong industry out there which really wants to protect itself and isn't looking independently. We don't have that sort of independence, and I always worry even that if we go out of Europe, that actually we'll have less of that research, less of that independence, and less encouragement to actually try to avoid using materials which have a toxic content. I think the other thing that I am interested in housing particularly, and how much we can contribute to preventing it. And I don't mean just, okay, we can choose materials, whether it's timber windows rather than PVC windows, or whether it's the cabling we put in, or trying to avoid PVCs or formaldehydes in the flooring and the boarding. The thing is, people bring in an awful lot of chemicals into the house. And obviously, if the floor is chipboard or something like that, well, first thing they'll do is put a laminate flooring on it, or PVC material down, or carpet. You know, and you know, there's a huge amount of formaldehydes and chemicals start being activated by that. So the internal air quality is a really important thing. And how do we, you know, if we can't control of these things, how do we actually exhaust them? How do we make sure that the air quality is good? What I don't know is how much of those chemicals that are released are ingested, or are they taken up by touching? You know, and it seems like it gets everywhere.
I think there are clearly a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
And what I'm going to do, I'm very conscious of the fact we don't have very much time, and I want to have some. There we go.
Is anyone aware of anything that's being done by the government, Scottish Building Regulations, to help control the amount of chemicals that we can put into, for example, buildings? Or, Jan, are you aware of any legislation that limits the amount of chemicals that you can put into soaps or creams? Is there anything there as a stick? Because the carrot ain't going to work.
Thank you.
Not to my knowledge, because I mean, particularly flame retardants. You know, there's no control over that, and yet you can avoid them. You know, and it's a good point that different building control officers have different approaches to these things in Scotland. And for instance, when we built a timber house in Inverness, we had to coat the surface of the walls, because we were leaving it as timber, in a flame retardant. Okay, it was a water-based flame retardant, but it was still a flame retardant. And we were really worried about that. But recently visited a similar sort of house using CLT, solid timber, in Portobello. And that building control officer hasn't requested any flame retardant, only in the fire escape area, but not in the houses. Now that's what it should be. So I do think there's a lot of either training or, people, you could just ban it. It's not needed a lot of the time. Trying to design it out. But there's certainly no encouragement and nothing written in terms of regulation as far as I know.
Can we follow with Andrew? You might be well positioned actually to know what the government guidelines might be.
Yeah. So I mean, in Scotland, a lot of the environmental issues, colleagues here know far more about the building site. A lot of the environmental issues will in fact be covered by the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. But also, again, John touched on it, with regard to Europe, we are covered in the UK, including Scotland, by European legislation which will set the minimum standards. So there's something called the Registration, Evaluation, Authorisation of Chemicals, REACH regulations, which would set some standards. But in that programme, they were talking about 100,000 chemicals out there. We're talking about probably 60,000 that are fairly common. And if you look at what the European Chemicals Agency will do in terms of setting safe standards on those that would apply to us in Scotland, there's very, very little that's going on. So there would be some regulations about certain pollutants. There certainly would be regulations about food, which is covered by the European Food Standards Agency. And there'd be some general regulations too, say about the production of building materials and so on. And environmental health and the Health and Safety Executive have certain standards that they would apply. So it's a sort of a mixed picture. But if we go outside the European Union, it looks highly likely that we'll be looking to the Americans to set the standards for what we do. And already there's a lot of deregulation in the UK and soft regulation on environment and health. I think it's highly likely it would deteriorate even faster just in this area.
And it goes without saying that we know little about the cocktail effect.
Absolutely. I mean, that point was coming out very, very strongly. And if you look at, there was a reference to large quantities of chemicals being used, and the film was absolutely right. I didn't pick up any inaccuracies there. The complete risk assessments that we have of chemicals are incredibly low.
Jan, do you have anything to add to that in respect to soaps and cleaning chemicals?
Anything that comes in contact with your skin, the producer will have to go through something which is called a cosmetic safety assessment. So they'll have to send their formulas off to a chemist, and the chemist will certify whether that's suitable or not. But there still are toxic chemicals in each of these, and phthalates and formaldehydes and quite nasty things in soaps and moisturisers. But if the product doesn't necessarily isn't applied to your skin, so it's not absorbed by the skin, then it's less stringent. So things like washing powder, air fresheners, those types of things don't undergo, but they're not regulated as much for mass production.
Thank you. And any questions, Chris?
Would it help us all to think about things which, that comment about bioaccumulation, so the things that are going to bioaccumulate in our body and won't go away, there's really nothing we can do. And that seems to me a different order of problem from the sorts of things that might degrade over time, and we could in some way live a different lifestyle which could get rid of them. I mean, I presume there are things that we can do nothing about and they will never go away, and others which we can actually act against and try to do the right thing. Would that help us to make decisions about what we really have to focus on in terms of legislation and our specification and things like that?
Andrew?
Well, one interesting development that's occurred is that in the US, in Massachusetts state, they have a law which is called Toxic Use Reduction Law, and they have a Toxic Use Reduction Institute, which is looking at how you can reduce exposure, sometimes in building materials, certainly MDF and so on, but also in other areas, that you can cut the most toxic substances, the cancer-causing substances, the endocrine disruptors, and so on. And they've actually got worked examples. So in Scotland, we could literally just take the work that has been done and greatly reduce, or in some instances remove, the quantities of those chemicals. But there are certainly some things that can't be done. And one area that was being touched on in that film that I am uneasy about, and I think the director was the point about women breastfeeding. And there was a huge stooshy between the Americans and the Scandinavians, because some of the Scandinavians started to say, well, actually, mother's milk is a problem, so let's not use mother's milk. We'll use the alternatives and the supplements. And the Americans said, well, hang on a minute, you know, if you're in inner city America, there's no way, you know, you're going to be able to necessarily get access, storage or whatever, but the costs and the benefits cropped up. So the benefits from having mother's milk were very positive, but you'd have the negatives of the pollution, you know, against the costs. And the cost-benefit analysis there, I think, internationally was probably, you know, you're better to try and persuade women, if it's appropriate, you know, to use their own milk rather than necessarily going for substitutes. But there are certainly a whole set of things that can be done in different sectors to reduce or remove these things. And some of these substances can be banned, and there are safer natural substances. Although again, you've got to be careful, as the film was saying, not all natural substances are safer, far from it. You know.
I think most breastfeeding mothers would prefer to tell chemical companies to leave out fire retardants than to stop breastfeeding on the bus or whatever. Andy, I'm wondering how you would communicate to housing associations on dealing with this agenda, where they should focus their attentions, if they should at all.
Well, the area that, if as a development manager, as a client manager, you have influence is on the briefing, critically on the briefing and specification. And so from that, you're relying on one level on the building regs, but we do know that they're probably reactive rather than proactive, historically. Other building standards, which up till just now are much more interested in energy performance aspects of environmental performance rather than products and chemicals. So we do tend to rely on architects who are generally much more proactive and interested in the content of their buildings in every aspect, for them to kind of inform the kind of briefing and specification process going forward. But that's something that's cumulative. Development managers do talk to each other. There are forums within Scottish Federation of Housing Associations to share information, and there's quite a proactive sector, if you like, in terms of looking at building performance and looking at ways of improving building performance, whether it's from reduction of chemical content and materials or improving space standards and energy performance and so on. So there's 2 or 3 different sources that we look at. In terms of how that is applied, there's the issue of the buildings, the materials that we put into the buildings. There's the performance of the building in supporting how people use it. And then lastly, which is the area that we'd have much less influence on, is the chemicals and products that people use when they're in the buildings. Now, there is an argument that we probably have to design to the lowest common denominator of how people might use their buildings, both again in terms of energy and in terms of what they might bring into the home. So the levels of ventilation are one of the kind of emerging critical issues at the moment, because the tighter we build buildings, that's going to have an impact on reinforcing whatever chemicals that we've installed and whatever chemicals the tenant or resident has brought in or is currently using.
In terms of the air quality, I would like to have some monitoring of those houses so that actually we know where we stand. There's a lot of people who don't want to use whole house ventilation system, even though that is now really a necessity when we're building new houses. And a lot of people in some of the housings that we built just go and switch them off. And we don't know the implication of that, but we suspect what the implication is, that air quality is very poor and it's detrimental to people's health. The other thing that we could do is possibly, when we are restoring houses or building houses, is to actually have floor surfaces that are finished and living spaces that are ready to move into, so that people don't have to put carpets down or laminated flooring down, and that we can depend on the quality of that surface. Now that is done a lot more in Europe, where the finished surfaces are really very, well, wood block or something like that, they're perfectly okay, so anybody can move in, move out, and you're not adding to any load on the building. So it's one area that I think, because we just leave it as chipboard or something, and it has to be covered with something. And I think that's one area that we could improve on the finished house. But people will say, oh, that's upmarket. But actually, I think it could be just standard for standard housing associations.
I come across this one all the time, and the housing association response, as far as I'm aware, is if they put in the flooring, they become responsible for the flooring. Whereas if you leave it as chipboard, then the tenant is responsible for the flooring. So actually, it's what we need is a robust, well-spec, non-toxic flooring system that housing associations don't worry about. But I haven't come across one yet. I have that argument about once a week thing at the moment. Yes.
Jake Wilson from Glasgow Calderwood University, doing a PhD. I was interested in Andrew's point about you feel like it's almost a ready-made institution in Massachusetts, which it might be useful to replicate in Scotland if possible. My question is, given there's probably quite low public awareness of these issues, what scope do the panel see for increasing the pressure from civil society for reduction and control of toxics?
I think there's certain things, certainly in Scotland, that are leading to greater awareness. And I think there are greater opportunities here, because partly of how things are set up and what does fall within the remit of the Scottish Government. I mean, clearly films like that are extremely effective, and I think John was touching on one of the issues. Probably one of the leading researchers looking at chemical substances is somebody called David Michaels in the US, who was is an epidemiologist, and he headed up one of Obama's agencies. Needless to say, he's now been sacked. But he actually wrote a book called Doubt is Their Product. And this is how industry will actually manipulate and suppress information that indicates that there are problems. So if you can get the information out by a whole range of means through social media and so on, and I think communities have done that with regard to fracking in quite an incredible way, you can move things along. The World Health Organization 25 years ago produced a charter on health and the environment, and it said citizens had a right to know about the hazards that they faced, or indeed the right to know that we didn't know whether or not there were hazards there. That's just as important. That they had a right to participate in those decisions, that low technologies should be used, and technologies only when tested should be used. And again, it was touched on in the film, a central plank should be that when you're making decisions about materials and processes and so on, that you safeguard the most vulnerable. So that wouldn't just be pregnant women and infants. It would be older people, it would be people who were ill, people who are immune compromised and so on. And if you're thinking about materials that you might be exposed to, I think that would be a very important way forward. And that fits in, just three other things to briefly mention. That fits in with the sort of debate about cumulative effects, long-term, low-level effects and so on. There's an epidemiologist who was called Jeffrey Rose who said that when you're looking at public health, probably the biggest issue isn't looking at small populations that are exposed to high levels of substances. It's actually what you should be doing is looking at large populations exposed to low levels of substances. And if you're thinking about how long people spend in dwellings, even compared to work, they may well be in their houses and so on for an awful lot longer than they'll be doing other things. So what now some researchers are saying is what you should be looking at are cumulative health impact assessments, which would take on board mixtures, which would take on board what you do in the house, what you use in the house, what you do at work, what you're exposed to outside. And in that context, there's something called an expo zone, which is a little bit like a sort of chemical passport. So what we should be doing is totting up what total exposure should be in a built environment, in the physical environment, and in the work environment. And if we can get over to people, this is what they ought to be looking for and demanding. And if we don't have that picture and we don't have the data about what effects there are, again, we should be precautionary and back to, you know, materials that we know don't present hazards. Sorry, a bit long-winded.
No, thank you very much. I am conscious that we've already run over time. I'm prepared to take one more question from Sam.
Are there any materials that don't present a hazard?
Right, you go into a shop and you see no BPA in this bottle, and actually it may have other things in it, you know, that are problematic. So we don't want to jump out the frying pan into the fire, but I think we've got good evidence about things that are less hazardous. You know, there are natural materials that won't get into the air, you won't absorb through the skin, and you won't ingest. So certainly that Toxics Use Reduction Institute has got details, you know, about those substances that will be less hazardous and less risky.
I think this issue with chemicals is something which is very instinctively understood by all of us in the room. And I think that is exactly the point that we get from Underkastellensen, which is that we are, despite it being instinctively something that we realise is wrong to produce 100,000 man-made chemicals and that cocktail effect, we still somehow just let it continue. And we don't perhaps create the riot that we should be doing and the objections that we should be creating to this. Interestingly, this theme is one which I believe goes through the whole of the Eco-Max series. When we start talking about money systems, I think most of us actually realise that the money system that we have isn't sustainable, any more than many of the technology choice systems that we have are sustainable. And yet, those eco-pioneers are all still pretty much countercultural characters. They're still people who are waving a flag, and not many people are joining flag waving. So this might be a very good opportunity to start actually just waving a few flags. What I really love about repeatedly seeing this film, of course, is the discussion it generates. It's fabulous. Stefan Jarl wants us to continue this discussion. He wants to get the DVD out. Please get one. Please go and show it to your friends and family. Please go and show it at your work, and get the message out. And can we all keep in touch, please? Because I think there are lots more discussions of this type to have. So thank you very much to our panel. Please thank them in the way.